Okay, welcome here to our next lesson. So we're taking a look here at Chapter 11, Race and Ethnicity. So what's interesting here is that we're continuing on the sort of inequality look here. So remember I said one of the most important things that sociologists do, or one of our major sort of focuses of study, is on inequality, or how people and why people are treated differently. Of course, race and ethnicity is one of those areas that historically people have been treated very differently because of. So, what we want to do here first is break down some of these notions. What are race? What is race? What is ethnicity? And where does it sort of come from? Where do these ideas come from? So, um, I do want to kind of start with what is a race. Now, uh, we have defined races, that is, biologically. So, what is supposed to make a race is some biological difference, some inherent born with this difference. Um, the problem is that when we go and actually try to define a race, we just try to define what is a race. White, black, is Hispanic a race? It's not according to the census, by the way. We get to this problem that we're not actually defining anything scientifically or even really biologically. So race is really more of a social construct. And what I mean by that is that your culture decides what races exist, and therefore those are the races that we see or notice or pay attention to. Now, the evidence for this social construction of race, and that is that it's constructed by people, by society, is that if you go around the world, people do not see races the same way Americans do. So, different societies define races differently. In some societies, like Brazil, for instance, one may actually change their race throughout the course of your life. So you may actually, your race may actually change. Another thing that's interesting, how Brazilians define race, is that your child may be a different race than either of the parents. Right? So we don't all define race the same way. So, race is something that we've given a lot of power to, this idea of race, we've given a lot of power to in our society, but it's not something that is actually biologically sound or really scientific, even though that's what it's supposed to be. If the idea of a race is supposed to be based upon science. So, um, let's look at what the government defines as races, just to kind of get you here on this, thinking about this. The government's definition of races, we have four groups essentially. A race here, the races listed by the government are white, black, uh, Native American, and Asian. These are all Asian sort of subgroupings. So those are the races, the official races listed by the census. Hispanic Latino is actually listed as an ethnic group, which we'll talk about here in a second. But before you say, well, if the government defined it, it must be true, I want to show you here the actual documentation for the census form. So just notice this comes from the U.S. Census Bureau, and they understand that what they're doing is not actually measuring race either. So it says here the race categories included in the census questionnaire generally reflect a social definition of race recognized in this country and are not an attempt to define race biologically, anthropologically, or genetically. Well, remember, that's what race is supposed to be. In addition, it is recognized that the categories of the race question include some race and national origin or sociocultural groups. I'm talking about ethnic groups here. What they're essentially telling you is, yes, we know we don't have actual measurements of race here, but people think it's real, therefore that's what we're measuring. So, just something to consider. Race is supposed to be a biological measure, but that's not actually what we do in the United States. So, well, if race is not a really great variable, then what is? Well, um, something that actually makes a lot more sense is this notion of ethnicity. An ethnic group is a group that shares cultural characteristics. And what we mean by cultural characteristics, right? Remember, we said culture are beliefs and values. Um, what we mean is people who come from the same place, nation of origin, who have an ancestry, a common ancestry, and a cultural heritage, so they have a similar culture. So, an ethnic group is a group of people who share a culture, essentially, right? They come from some place and they share a culture. In the United States, um, all of these European groups, Germans, if you can't see it, this is a listing of groups in the United States. But at the top it says German and then Irish and English and Italian. So Italian Americans would be an ethnic group. Irish Americans would be an ethnic group. German Americans would be an ethnic group. Um, Remember, I said that they list Latino as an ethnic group. Really, the ethnic group there would be the subgroups. So, Mexican American would be an ethnic group. Uh, uh, Brazilian American would be an ethnic group because Latinos count all of these people really from Central to South America as one group. And that's kind of, that's not a very great way to do it. I mean, we do it in the United States, that's what we do, but people from Mexico don't have the same culture as people from Puerto Rico, don't have the same culture as people from Brazil. These are all very different cultures. Many of them speak the same language, not all of them, but the cultures are very different. So, an ethnic group is people who come from the same place and share a culture. So, sociologists are much more inclined to think about or talk about ethnic groups. Now, we talk a lot about race because race matters to Americans. And what I mean is, since Americans are so focused on race, we sort of study why that is and we study the implications of it. Now, one of the major implications, of course, of race and ethnicity, and I'm gonna skip here by the minority group and the dominant group. Read about that in your textbook. What defines a minority group and what defines a dominant group? Because what I want to jump ahead to here is how why it actually matters. Why does it matter? And when we do look at race and we look at ethnicity, what are we looking at? And what we're really looking at, and the reason it sort of matters, is that people treat people differently based upon the groups they belong to. So I want to separate these two things, which you've probably heard of, so you can kind of understand the difference between them: prejudice and discrimination. So, prejudice is thoughts. If you want a one word sort of definition here, prejudice is thoughts. Discrimination is action. So, prejudice is sort of unfair thoughts about people, how you group people together, and have these sort of unfair feelings about a group. The discrimination is when one actually acts upon it. Right? So the discrimination is when one actually goes out and does something about it. For example, not hiring someone because of their race or gender or whatever would be discrimination. Thinking that someone was less than you because of their race or gender or whatever, that would be prejudice. So they oftentimes go hand in hand, but they're separate because, for one, discrimination, the action, is against the law. You cannot discriminate. But prejudice is legal. It's certainly in this country. You can believe whatever you want to believe. It's the actions that are the things that are against the law. So we have in our society still a lot of prejudice and a lot of discrimination. Now, um, I'm going to put something up on Angel so you get a chance to actually measure perhaps your own levels of prejudice. Now, when you see this on Angel, this will be this is only for your knowledge. I won't see any of the results of this. This will be, it'll send you to another website to actually take this, but you can sort of check. Sociologists know from all of our research that all Americans have some level of prejudice. Um, it's just what has been sort of trained into our culture for so long. There are of course levels of prejudice, but we're all prejudiced. We all have unfair beliefs about someone or some group or something at some time. So take a look at that link because you'll get. I think you'll find it interesting. I certainly do. Discrimination, on the other hand, is the actions. Now, there's two types of discrimination. There's individual discrimination, which is one-on-one discrimination. So that's the probably what you think of when you think about discrimination. Someone not hiring someone because of their race or ethnicity, not renting to someone because of their race, ethnicity, or gender, whatever, sexuality. That's individual discrimination, one-on-one. What's perhaps even more troubling is something that is unfortunately common in our society, which is institutional discrimination. Institutional discrimination is discrimination that becomes built into the system. It becomes the normal way that an institution operates. So you may see, for example, I won't go over this in detail, but this actually shows institutional discrimination at banks. And what this information here shows, if you can see it, is that African Americans and Latinos are less likely to be approved for loans, for a home loan, than are whites. So African Americans and Latinos are more likely to be turned down here, denied for a mortgage, and they're looking at apples to apples. So they're comparing people who make the same amount of money and have the same credit score. So if those are actually the important points, how much money you make and your credit score, then people, no matter what your race or ethnicity, these bars should be equal, and it's not. And this isn't at one bank. This is at a measurement of almost or 9,300 banks. So pretty much all the banks that do home loans. So that's what's meant by institutional discrimination. Somehow these policies have become built into how these banks actually operate. And so that's a real big problem and can potentially be a very big problem in our society. So there you have it, a little introduction to race and ethnicity. Of course, this can go on, but be sure to turn to the book. One thing you're going to want to focus on are some of those theories of prejudice. So if prejudice is really the root of the problem, and that people have these thoughts about other groups, where does prejudice come from? Now, there's some sociological theories that answer that question. Functionalism, symbolic interactionism, and conflict theory all have answers to that question. Why are people prejudiced? And you can probably guess that a lot's going to have to do with socialization. In other words, people learn it, but why do they learn it? So check that out in the book, and it's certainly going to be some valuable information. So once again, have a great week.